The summer of 1298 found Scotland still formally unconquered, but hanging on by a thread. 1 year earlier, in September 1297, a smaller Scottish force under William Wallace and Andrew Moray had annihilated an English army at Stirling Bridge, exploiting terrain, timing, and English overconfidence. Moray would soon die of wounds sustained there, leaving Wallace as the dominant figure in the Scottish resistance. By March 1298, Wallace had been named Guardian of the Realm, ruling in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. Yet Wallace's authority rested on fragile foundations. Scotland's magnates, men such as Robert Bruce, John Comyn, and James Stewart, were divided by rivalry, loyalty to England, and self-interest. Wallace prepared his force for another imminent invasion. He commanded 6,000 infantry, mostly spearmen, equipped with long shafts that resembled pikes than actual spears. These men were drawn from the common people, and perhaps 1,000 light cavalry, many of them nobles whose loyalty to Wallace was uncertain, and no more than 500 archers. Wallace arranged his spearmen into large circular formations called schiltrons, dense masses of men, bristling outward with long spears planted in the ground or held at an angle. When properly formed, schiltrons were devastatingly effective against cavalry, as Stirling Bridge had demonstrated. At Falkirk, Wallace likely deployed 4 major schiltrons, each several hundred men deep, separated by narrow gaps. Between and behind them he placed his archers, poorly equipped compared to their English counterparts, his cavalry at the rear. Unlike at Stirling Bridge, Wallace had no narrow choke point to exploit. King Edward I of England, however, was not a ruler inclined to forgive humiliation. In the spring of 1298, Edward personally took the field, determined to destroy Wallace and end the rebellion decisively. Edward's army was the largest he had ever led into Scotland. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, but modern historians place the English force at roughly 10,000 to 12,000 infantry, including Welsh spearmen, 2,500 cavalry, heavily armored knights and men-at-arms, a significant contingent of longbowmen, perhaps 1,500. Thus, on the 22nd of July, 1298, the two armies faced each other near a marshy plain south of Falkirk, bounded by woodland and flat terrain. The English army came into view. Edward had arrayed his army with methodical precision. The English cavalry led the army, divided into multiple divisions. The infantry and archers followed at the rear guard. Edward himself commanded from the rear, overseeing the battle with a commander's eye hardened by decades of warfare. The Scottish army stood silent, their spears planted in the earth, waiting patiently for the fight to come to them. The English cavalry attacked first. Waves of armored knights charged the schiltrons. The Scottish formations held their ground. The eager English cavalry opened the battle. They attempted to encircle William's men. They met resistance on the left wing by contingents of Scottish cavalry. In a rather foolish maneuver, the Scottish cavalry attacked the much larger English force head-on. The Scottish cavalry were outnumbered, outskilled and outmatched by every metric. They fought valiantly but ultimately stood no chance against their heavier English foe. Wallace did not join in the wasteful engagement. Instead, he remained behind the protection of his infantry. But once the fight on the left had dissolved and the Scottish cavalry were broken, he found refuge in the safety of his schiltron infantry. What the strategical plan was to allow his small force of cavalry to be destroyed in such a manner was not clear. Perhaps William failed to act rapidly enough, or perhaps they underestimated their chances against the mightier English cavalry. The few Scots who survived the chaos fled into the nearby woods. Now the remaining Scottish force was left without any cavalry support and were undoubtedly sitting ducks in the open. The English cavalry now turned their attention towards the exposed Scottish archers. They were rowed down mercilessly without much fight. In just a short time span, William's force was without both his cavalry and archers. This was a strategical disaster for his army. Sources don't explain as to why William would allow his riders and bowmen to be used in such a wasteful manner, especially how he chose to position his archers outside the protection of the enclosed Schiltron infantry. This was a disastrous tactical error that ultimately condemned his force to defeat before the main battle had even begun. Whatever little hope remained for the Scots was to be left in the hands of their formidable pike infantry. Waves of armored knights charged the Schiltrons. William's infantry lowered their pikes and braced themselves for the menacing stampede that descended upon them. The English knights and cavalry smashed into the Scottish ranks. Horses reared and screamed as they were impaled on spear points. Knights were thrown or crushed beneath their mounts. Some successfully penetrated through the forest of pointed spears, but not nearly enough to overtake the Scottish position. Horses reared and screamed as they were impaled on spear points. Knights were thrown or crushed beneath their mounts. The Schiltrons proved what Wallace intended. Against cavalry alone, disciplined infantry could survive. Ultimately, Edward's cavalry could not penetrate the Scottish Schiltrons. They were forced to disengage and re-evaluate the situation. Edward recognized the futility of further mounted charges against the Scottish pikes. He carefully observed from a distance that his cavalry alone could not break William's battle-tested Schiltrons. The English king, a wise and competent commander, changed his approach. He sent word to his cavalry commanders to cease their attack, pull back and hold their positions. They were to wait patiently for the rest of the English force to arrive. The bulk of the English army, all infantry, primarily spearmen and men-at-arms, as well as the entirety of their archers, had arrived to the battlefield. The English king ordered his Welsh longbowmen forward. The English longbow was the most formidable missile weapon in Europe, capable of firing armor-piercing arrows at a terrifying rate. The archers positioned themselves, took aim, and fired a horrifying barrage of arrows, thousands at a time. The sky darkened with arrows. The tightly packed Scottish spearmen, immobile and exposed, had no shields or armor sufficient to stop the storm. Men fell by the hundreds, transfixed by shafts that pierced flesh and mail alike. A practiced longbowman archer could send between 6 to 10 arrows a minute. Each release carried over 100 pounds of sheer force, sending the arrow at a rate of 180 feet per second. Each minute brought another storm, each storm another thinning of the line. The lightly armored Scottish infantry stood no chance. It was a massacre. The arrow volleys continued until the Scottish Schiltron formations were completely dissolved. Large gaps from every angle were exposed. The only factor that protected William's men from complete destruction was now removed from the equation. With the Schiltrons weakened by arrows and no Scottish cavalry threat remaining, Edward sent forth his English heavy cavalry and knights to exploit the gaps. English cavalry smashed into the broken formations, cutting down exhausted and wounded Scottish troops. The charges were devastating. William's men were crushed or sent flying by the impact of the heavy horses. As opposed to a fair fight, the battle dissolved into a fight for survival. Edward, however, showed no mercy. He sent forth his infantry to put an end to William Wallace's rebellious Scots once and for all. Thousands of English infantry poured forward. They crashed into the already tired and depleted Scottish infantry. The English had them completely surrounded, making escape extremely difficult. Surrounded on all sides, the Scots fought like cornered wild beasts. In the heat of the fight, many English troops were struck down by the desperate Scots. who above all else were in a state of sheer survival mode, making them all the more dangerous. Regardless, Edward's force was too numerous, and Wallace's men were too weakened. The battle became a slaughter. Scottish troops were cut down as they tried to flee. Others stood their ground and died where they stood, surrounded by their fallen comrades. It was reported that William Wallace managed to escape with a sizable amount of his army. How he escaped is unknown, perhaps aided by loyal followers, perhaps simply lost in the chaos he was able to slip away. He vanished from the field as the English secured a complete victory. Scottish losses were devastating. Thousands were killed. The English losses were not as bleak, but nonetheless they did suffer upwards of 1,000 or some men. Edward had won the battle, but not the war. In the immediate aftermath, English control over Scotland appeared restored. Edward reoccupied key strongholds and pursued Wallace relentlessly. Yet the king soon faced renewed logistical problems and resistance, forcing him to withdraw south by autumn. For Wallace personally, Falkirk marked a turning point. He would continue to fight as a guerrilla leader, but never again command a national army. In 1305, he would be captured, tried for treason, and brutally executed in London.